The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon, a completely ordinary day. I was at my desk, reviewing quarterly reports, the kind of steady work that made up most of my life. My mom, Diane, sounded bright, almost giddy, as she announced they'd finally found the perfect house for my sister, Ashley, and her husband, Kevin. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a backyard big enough for Lily and Max to run around in. She described the granite countertops and the finished basement with such detail, you'd think she was reading from a real estate listing. I congratulated her, assuming they'd helped with a down payment or co-signed the loan. Ashley, you see, had always struggled a bit with money, bouncing between part-time jobs, often blaming her circumstances on having 2 young kids. Kevin worked construction, which meant winters were lean. Still, I figured this was their chance to finally build some stability. Diane kept talking about closing costs and inspection fees. The numbers seemed high, but I stayed focused on my computer screen, only half listening. Then she said something that made my fingers freeze on the keyboard. "We'll need you to cover the mortgage payments until they get on their feet." I asked her to repeat that. She laughed, acting like I'd made a joke. "Well, you've saved enough over the years. It's time you help family." The casual assumption in her voice hit me harder than the actual request. I'd spent 15 years building my career in financial consulting, living in a modest apartment, driving a 10-year-old sedan, and skipping vacations to pad my retirement accounts. Every promotion came from working weekends and taking on projects nobody else wanted. My savings represented sacrifice, not some pile of money I'd stumbled into. I told her I couldn't do that. The line went silent for several seconds. "Can't or won't?" My dad, Robert, came through instead. He must have been listening on another phone. I explained that my financial planning didn't include supporting another household. Ashley and Kevin needed to find something within their actual budget. This house sounded beyond their means, which made the whole situation a setup for failure. Robert's tone shifted from surprise to cold. He reminded me about all the times they'd helped me through college, how they paid for my textbooks, and covered my car insurance until I was 23. Family meant supporting each other, he said. Ashley needed this more than I needed another zero in my bank account. The guilt settled into my chest, heavy and familiar. I'd heard variations of this speech my whole life. Ashley was the one who needed extra help with homework, who got extensions on curfew because she struggled with responsibility, who received a new car when she totaled hers junior year because mistakes happen. I was the responsible one, the one who didn't require much attention, the one who figured things out independently. I held firm. The answer was no. Diane got back on the line, her voice shaking. She called me selfish, said she didn't raise me to turn my back on family. Robert added that they'd already signed the paperwork, already committed to the purchase. They'd used their retirement savings for the down payment because they believed I'd step up. My stomach dropped. They'd made a 6-figure financial decision based on an assumption without even asking me first. I wanted to scream, but I kept my voice level. I told them this was their choice to undo, not my responsibility to fix. The following week became a nightmare of constant contact. Every family gathering I'd normally attend turned into an intervention. Sunday dinner invitations were actually ambushes where relatives cornered me about my decision. My Uncle David showed up at my apartment unannounced, saying he'd always thought of me as the smart one and couldn't understand why I was being so stubborn. I tried explaining my position rationally. Ashley and Kevin's combined income was roughly $48,000 annually. The mortgage payment alone would be $3,200 monthly, not including property taxes, insurance, utilities, and maintenance. They were looking at housing costs that consumed nearly their entire income. Even with my help, the situation was unsustainable. Nobody wanted to hear the math. They wanted to hear me say yes. Grandma Eleanor called from Arizona, her voice frail and disappointed. She'd always bragged about having such a successful granddaughter. Now she wondered if success had changed me into someone she didn't recognize. The guilt hit differently coming from her. She'd slipped me $20 bills throughout my childhood, telling me to save it for college. Those small gifts had mattered. I visited her the following month, flying down to explain everything in person. She listened while we sat on her porch, the warm breeze carrying the scent of salt. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Your parents made a mistake," she finally said. "A big one, but families forgive mistakes." I asked if that applied to my mistake, too, or just theirs. She didn't have an answer. Ashley started posting on social media about the stress of potentially losing their dream home. She never mentioned me directly, but the implications were clear. Friends who knew our situation filled the comments with supportive messages and prayers. A few asked what had happened to her sister, whether I'd offered to help. Kevin's father, Mr. Peterson, reached out separately, man to man, as he put it. We met for coffee at a diner halfway between our towns. Mr. Peterson was a retired electrician, straightforward and practical. He admitted Kevin wasn't great with money, but insisted the boy worked hard when work was available. This house could give his grandchildren the stability they'd never had. I asked if he'd considered helping with the mortgage himself. He looked down at his coffee cup, stirring it slowly. His pension barely covered his own expenses. He'd love to help but couldn't afford it. "So, you understand my position then?" I said. He met my eyes across the table. "I understand you got more than I do. That comes with responsibility." The assumption that my money created an obligation to everyone else was exhausting. I'd worked 80-hour weeks for years to build my savings. I'd eaten ramen dinners and skipped social events to maximize my 401k contributions. Every dollar represented a choice I'd made, a sacrifice I'd accepted. Ashley had made different choices. She'd dropped out of community college after one semester, saying it wasn't for her. She'd worked retail jobs that she'd quit when managers annoyed her. She'd gotten pregnant with Lily at 22, which I'd supported completely, but she'd also refused to consider how that would impact her career trajectory. I wasn't judging her life choices. I was simply refusing to fund the consequences of them. The pressure intensified as the closing date approached. Diane sent daily texts with updates. They'd hired movers. Ashley had picked out paint colors for the kids' rooms. Lily had told her entire third-grade class about the backyard with the swing set. Each message was designed to increase my guilt, to make me feel responsible for disappointing a 9-year-old child. It worked. I felt terrible, but feeling terrible didn't change the fundamental problem. I consulted a financial advisor, laying out the entire situation. If I agreed to pay the mortgage, what would that do to my retirement planning? He ran the numbers, factoring in 30 years of $3,200 monthly payments, plus probable increases in property taxes and insurance. The total came to well over $1 million in today's money. Accounting for inflation and lost investment opportunity, I'd be sacrificing roughly $2 million from my retirement fund. I'd need to work an additional 15 years to recover that loss. He asked the obvious question, would Ashley and Kevin ever be in a position to take over the payments? I couldn't answer honestly without admitting the truth. No, probably not. This would be a permanent arrangement. The advisor closed his laptop and looked at me seriously. You're essentially being asked to fund someone else's retirement while destroying your own. That's not help. That's sacrificing your financial security. His words crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate. This wasn't about being generous versus being stingy. It was about being asked to light my future on fire for someone who'd never even asked if I had matches. I drafted an email to my parents, laying out everything the financial advisor had explained. I attached spreadsheets showing the long-term impact, comparison charts, projected retirement scenarios. I thought maybe seeing the actual numbers would help them understand. Robert's response came within an hour. Since when did family require spreadsheets? Diane didn't respond at all. The closing happened on a Thursday. Ashley posted photos of the keys, the front door, Lily and Max playing in the yard. The comments flooded in with congratulations and excitement. Nobody mentioned how they'd be paying for it. I muted her on social media, but couldn't bring myself to unfriend her. Some small part of me kept hoping this would blow over, that they'd find a solution, that our family would survive this intact. That hope died when the first mortgage payment came due. Ashley called an hour later, crying. Lily and Max were so excited about having their own rooms. How could I ruin this for them? Kevin had already told his landlord they were moving out. They had nowhere else to go. I suggested they find a rental within their budget or look for a smaller house. Ashley sobbed harder, saying I'd always been jealous of her, always looked down on her life choices. She hung up before I could respond. The family text chain started that evening. Aunt Carol sent a long message about family loyalty and Christian values. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years weighed in with their opinions. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Each one another person telling me I was wrong, heartless, ungrateful. I turned off my phone and poured a glass of wine. Laura from work had warned me years ago about setting boundaries with family. She'd gone through something similar with her brother, and the fallout had lasted years. I'd always thought my family was different, that we communicated better than that. Apparently not. The lawsuit papers arrived 6 weeks later. Robert and Diane Whitmore versus their daughter. Case No. CV 202248847. They were suing me for $650,000, claiming verbal contract and promissory estoppel. The legal document stated I promised to help Ashley, that they'd relied on this promise to their detriment, and that I was now refusing to honor my commitment. I sat in my apartment reading the complaint 3 times, trying to make sense of how we'd gotten here. My parents were actually taking me to court. They'd hired Michael Lee, a lawyer who specialized in family disputes, and they were seeking enough money to cover the mortgage, property taxes, and insurance for 10 years. My hands shook as I called my own attorney, Eleanor Vance, who'd handled my estate planning. She reviewed the documents and asked if I'd ever put anything in writing. I hadn't. Had I ever explicitly promised to pay? Absolutely not. Had I been present when they made the purchase? No. Eleanor seemed confident we could win, but she warned me the process would be ugly. Family lawsuits always were. Discovery was brutal. They subpoenaed my bank records, investment accounts, and tax returns. Michael Lee argued that my substantial assets proved I could easily afford to help, and my refusal was purely vindictive. He painted me as a wealthy miser hoarding money while my sister's children faced potential homelessness. The local newspaper got wind of the case. Sister refuses to help family. Gets sued made the headline. The article included quotes from Ashley about her struggles as a working mother and her shock at my betrayal. They included my job title and salary range, making me look even worse. Old friends stopped calling. Neighbors avoided eye contact in the hallway. Someone left a note on my car calling me a selfish witch, in less polite terms. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to avoid thinking about the trial. My boss noticed the strain and suggested I take some personal time. I refused. Staying busy was the only thing keeping me sane. Depositions began in March. I sat across from Michael Lee while he asked about every financial decision I'd made in the past decade. Why had I chosen to save so aggressively? Did I not care about my niece and nephew's well-being? Had I always felt superior to Ashley? Eleanor objected frequently, but the question still stung. Lee was good at his job, twisting my responsible choices into evidence of selfishness. Ashley's deposition was worse. She cried through most of it, describing how she'd struggled after Max was born, how Kevin's income wasn't reliable, how Diane and Robert had always helped her because I never needed anything. She claimed I told her once that I'd always be there for her, which apparently constituted a binding promise in her mind. I'd said that when we were teenagers after her first boyfriend broke up with her. Using it as legal evidence felt absurd and heartbreaking in equal measure. The trial date got set for September. Eleanor prepared me for testimony, coaching me on staying calm and sticking to facts. The case would likely come down to credibility and contract law. Since nothing was in writing, we just needed to prove I'd never made a specific promise to pay their mortgage. Summer crawled by. I lost 12 pounds from stress and developed a persistent headache that wouldn't respond to medication. My doctor suggested therapy. I went twice before deciding I didn't have time for it. Diane called the week before trial asking if I wanted to settle. They'd accept $500,000 instead of the full amount. I told her no, then asked if she realized what she was doing to our relationship. She said I'd made this choice when I refused to help Ashley. The line went dead. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Judge Evelyn Reed presided, a woman in her early 60s with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She had a reputation for no-nonsense rulings and zero tolerance for emotional manipulation. Michael Lee presented his case first, calling Ashley to the stand. She wore a modest dress and minimal makeup, looking young and vulnerable. Lee walked her through her financial struggles, Kevin's inconsistent work, the kids' needs. Ashley explained how Diane and Robert had found the perfect house. How they'd all been so excited. How I'd initially seemed supportive. Did you believe your sister would help with the mortgage? Lee asked. Absolutely, Ashley said, dabbing her eyes. She'd always been the successful one. We thought she'd want to help family. Eleanor cross-examined carefully, establishing that I'd never seen the house, never discussed specific payment amounts, never signed anything. Ashley admitted the actual conversation had been brief and that I'd said no within minutes of hearing about the plan. "So, your sister explicitly refused to pay the mortgage?" Eleanor asked. "Yes, but we thought she'd come around. Family helps each other." Diane and Robert testified next, describing their retirement savings depleted by the down payment. Robert's voice cracked as he talked about potentially losing their own home to cover Ashley's mortgage. Diane glared at me from the witness stand, her expression mixing hurt and fury. Eleanor had warned me this part would be difficult. Watching my parents paint themselves as victims was surreal. They described their sleepless nights, their worry about Ashley and the kids, their disbelief that their own daughter would let them suffer like this. Michael Lee introduced financial documents showing their depleted savings account. The numbers were stark. They'd withdrawn $140,000 for the down payment and closing costs, leaving them with barely $30,000 in retirement funds. At their age, recovering from that would be nearly impossible. But whose fault was that? I wanted to stand up and scream the question at everyone in the courtroom. They'd made that withdrawal without consulting me, without securing my agreement, without any backup plan if I said no. Lee called their financial advisor to the stand, a man named Mark Allen, who'd apparently counseled against the purchase. Allen testified that he'd explicitly warned my parents not to deplete their retirement savings without a written commitment from me. They proceeded anyway, telling him I'd come through because that's what family did. Eleanor's cross-examination of Allen was masterful. She got him to confirm that responsible financial planning required written agreements, especially for large sums. She established that my parents had ignored professional advice because they'd assumed without basis that I'd comply with their wishes. The lunch recess came as a relief. I sat in a small conference room with Eleanor, barely touching the sandwich she'd ordered for me. My stomach was in knots. Laura had texted supportive messages throughout the morning along with several colleagues who'd followed the case in the news. The afternoon session brought character witnesses. Aunt Carol testified about what a loving family we'd always been, how holidays were full of laughter, how she'd never seen siblings as close as Ashley and me growing up. She described helping me with a school project when I was 12, how I thanked her repeatedly and told her family was everything. That memory was real. I had felt that way once, but family was supposed to work both ways. And somewhere along the line, the definition had shifted to mean I gave while everyone else received. Lee paraded several of Ashley's friends to the stand. They talked about her struggles as a mother, her dedication to her kids despite limited resources, her excitement about finally having a real home. Each one mentioned how hurt she was by my refusal, how she couldn't understand why her successful sister wouldn't help. One friend, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, got emotional describing how Lily had cried when she learned they might lose the house. "That little girl asked me why her aunt hated her," Sarah said, dabbing her eyes. What kind of person does that to a child? I felt the courtroom shift. Several spectators reacted with whispers, head shakes, pointed looks in my direction. Lee had successfully painted me as the villain in a story about an innocent child's dashed dreams. Eleanor's cross-examination focused on facts. Had any of these friends offered to help Ashley with the mortgage? No. Had they contributed to a fund for the down payment? No. Were they willing to co-sign the loan? Of course not. "So, everyone agrees someone should help," Eleanor said. As long as that someone is my client. The point landed, but I wasn't sure it mattered. Facts and emotions were fighting for dominance, and emotions had a strong advantage. Lee rested his case by late afternoon. The weight of their testimony hung in the air like smoke, making it hard to breathe. Eleanor squeezed my shoulder as we packed up for the day, reminding me we had the law on our side. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Sarah's testimony about Lily crying. My 9-year-old niece, confused and hurt, thinking I hated her. The image was devastating, but giving in now wouldn't fix that. It would just teach Lily that manipulation worked. That crying got you what you wanted regardless of reality or responsibility. Wasn't that the same lesson that had turned Ashley into someone who couldn't manage her own finances? The next morning brought my testimony. Eleanor had coached me extensively on staying calm, answering only what was asked, avoiding emotional reactions. I wore a navy suit and minimal jewelry, wanting to look professional without seeming flashy. She walked me through my career history first, establishing the work I'd put in to reach my current position. Starting as a junior analyst, working my way up through sheer determination, endless extra hours. My first apartment had been a studio with broken heating, but the rent was cheap enough to let me save aggressively. Did you inherit money from anyone? Eleanor asked. No. Win the lottery? No. Receive any large gifts or windfalls? No. Everything I have, I earned and saved myself. She had me explain my financial philosophy, the spreadsheets I maintained, the retirement calculators I used. I'd run the numbers hundreds of times, planning for different scenarios, always trying to ensure I'd never be a burden on anyone. Did your parents ever ask you directly if you would pay this mortgage before purchasing the house? No, they didn't. When they did tell you about the purchase, what was your response? I said I couldn't do it. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes. I was clear and immediate in my refusal. Eleanor established the timeline carefully. Phone call on Tuesday afternoon. Purchase already committed. My refusal within minutes of learning about their expectation. No ambiguity, no maybe, no let me think about it. Then came Michael Lee's cross-examination, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lee's cross-examination was aggressive. He questioned my values, my priorities, my relationship with my niece and nephew. I kept my answers short and factual, refusing to let him provoke an emotional response. Do you love your sister? He asked. Yes. Do you want her children to have a stable home? Of course. Then why won't you help them? Because helping would mean enabling financial irresponsibility and sacrificing my own security for a decision I wasn't part of making. Lee pressed harder, but I held steady. Eleanor had prepared me well. He pulled out bank statements showing my savings account balance. You have over $400,000 in liquid savings alone. Correct? Yes. And investment accounts totaling another $600,000 approximately. So, you have over $1 million while your sister struggles to keep a roof over her children's heads. Eleanor objected. Relevance, Your Honor. My client's financial status doesn't create an obligation. It speaks to her ability to help, Lee countered. Judge Reed allowed the line of questioning to continue, though she looked skeptical. Lee hammered on the disparity between my wealth and Ashley's poverty. He brought up every luxury I'd purchased in the past 5 years. A new laptop, a weekend trip to Vermont, a gym membership. Each one was framed as evidence of my selfishness. You can afford a $1,200 laptop, but won't help your niece have her own bedroom, he asked. I took a breath before answering. That laptop is a work tool, and yes, I make different financial choices than my sister because I have different priorities and career paths. That doesn't make her children my financial responsibility. Even when your parents explicitly relied on you, they never asked me. They assumed. There's a significant legal and ethical difference. Lee shifted tactics, bringing up childhood memories. Remember when Ashley shared her Halloween candy with me? When she defended me against a bully in middle school? When she'd helped me practice for my driver's test? She's always been there for you, Lee said. And now that she needs you, you turn your back. I'm not turning my back. I'm declining to fund a house I never agreed to help purchase. Those are not the same thing. He asked about family dinners, holidays, shared experiences. Each question designed to paint me as the ungrateful sister who'd forgotten where she came from. I answered truthfully, but felt the emotional manipulation working on everyone watching. Your parents are in their 60s, Lee said. They took money from their retirement because they trusted you. Doesn't that trust mean anything? It means they made a poor financial decision based on an assumption they never verified. I feel badly about that, but I can't undo their choice by making an equally poor one myself. The questioning went on for nearly 2 hours. Lee was thorough and relentless, trying to find any crack in my composure. Eleanor objected when appropriate, but mostly let me handle his attacks. We discussed this strategy, showing the court I could defend my position calmly and rationally. Finally, Lee asked about my future plans. Did I intend to get married, have children, buy a bigger home? Eventually, perhaps, I said. So, you're saving for your hypothetical future family while ignoring your actual current family. I'm planning responsibly for my life while declining to subsidize someone else's poor planning. Lee's expression showed frustration. He'd expected me to break, to show anger or guilt or something he could use. Instead, I'd remained steady, factual, and unapologetic. He dismissed me with obvious disappointment. I returned to my seat beside Eleanor, my hands shaking slightly now that the ordeal was over. Eleanor called several witnesses on my behalf. A former professor who testified about my work ethic in college, describing how I'd worked 2 part-time jobs while maintaining a 3.8 GPA. My current boss, who explained the value I brought to the company and the hours I'd invested in building my career. Laura testified about our friendship, describing conversations we'd had about financial boundaries and family dynamics. She confirmed I'd talked about my concerns regarding Ashley's money management years before this situation arose. She's not cold or unfeeling, Laura told the court. She's practical and self-protective. There's a difference. Eleanor's final witness was a financial expert who explained the long-term impact of what my parents were asking. He walked through calculations similar to what my own advisor had shown, demonstrating that agreeing to this mortgage would essentially cost me my retirement security. In financial planning terms, the expert testified, we call this financial elder abuse in reverse. Younger family members pressuring a financially stable relative to deplete their resources. It's more common than people realize and almost always ends badly for everyone involved. Lee objected vigorously, calling the characterization inflammatory. Judge Reed sustained the objection but didn't strike the testimony from the record. The point had been made. The testimony wrapped up by late afternoon, both sides having presented everything they could. Judge Reed looked exhausted and I felt completely drained. The courtroom emptied slowly, spectators filing out with whispered conversations about what they'd witnessed. I caught fragments of their discussions, some sympathetic to my position, others clearly viewing me as the villain. Ashley left with Diane and Robert, none of them looking in my direction. Eleanor and I stayed behind, organizing documents and preparing for closing arguments. She seemed cautiously optimistic, pointing out that the facts were solidly in our favor. No written agreement, no verbal promise before the purchase, immediate refusal when informed. The law was clear on these points, but law and family were different beasts entirely, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd lost something far more valuable than any house, regardless of how the judge ruled. That evening, I returned to my apartment and found an envelope slipped under my door. No return address, just my first name written in Max's careful 6-year-old handwriting. Inside was a crayon drawing of our family. Stick figures labeled Mommy, Daddy, Lily, Max, Grandma, Grandpa, and off to the side, separated by what looked like a wall, a figure labeled Aunt. The isolation in that drawing hit harder than any testimony. To Max, I wasn't part of the family unit anymore. I was outside, alone, separated. He'd illustrated what everyone felt, but hadn't quite articulated so plainly. I put the drawing on my refrigerator, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe as a reminder of what was at stake. Maybe as evidence that I wasn't the monster they thought I was. I still cared, still felt the loss acutely. Sleep didn't come easily. I replayed moments from the trial, wondering if I'd said the wrong thing, if I'd come across as cold or calculating. Laura had texted earlier saying I'd done great, that I'd remained composed under pressure. But composure wasn't the same as being right. And being legally right wasn't the same as being morally right. The question kept circling. Was I wrong? I'd run the numbers 1,000 times. The financial reality was undeniable, but numbers didn't account for Lily's tears or Max's drawing or the way Diane had looked at me in the courtroom like I was a stranger. My phone buzzed around midnight. A text from a number I didn't recognize. I hope you can live with yourself. You're destroying this family. I blocked the number and tried to sleep. The next morning brought closing arguments. The courtroom filled again, somehow even more packed than before. Word had spread about the case, and people were invested in the outcome. I recognized a few reporters in the back row, notebooks ready. Michael Lee stood first, his closing argument polished and emotional. He painted a picture of a family torn apart by greed, of elderly parents who'd sacrificed their security trusting in their daughter's love, of innocent children caught in the crossfire of adult selfishness. This isn't about legal technicalities, Lee argued, pacing before the judge. It's about fundamental human decency. The defendant has the means to help. She has the resources to ensure her niece and nephew have a stable home. She simply chooses not to, hiding behind contract law and financial planning while her family suffers. He referenced my testimony, my careful answers, my refusal to show emotion. Notice how she never once expressed regret, he said. Never once said she wished she could help but couldn't. She can help. She won't help. There's a profound difference. Lee concluded by asking Judge Reed to look beyond strict legal interpretation and consider the equitable principles at play. My parents had reasonably relied on family bonds and past patterns of support. I'd benefited from their help throughout my life, and now I was refusing to reciprocate when they needed me most. It was a compelling argument, I had to admit. If I didn't know the full context, I might have sided with him. Eleanor's closing was different in tone, but equally powerful. She started with contract law fundamentals, establishing that assumptions and expectations couldn't create binding obligations. No meeting of minds, no mutual assent, no consideration exchanged. Mr. Lee wants you to ignore the law in favor of sentiment, Eleanor said. But this court exists to apply law, not to redistribute wealth based on emotional appeals. My client worked for 15 years to build her savings. She made sacrifices, delayed gratification, and planned responsibly for her future. The plaintiffs made none of those choices and now want to penalize her for their lack of planning. She addressed the family obligation argument directly. Helping family is admirable when it's voluntary and sustainable. What the plaintiffs demand isn't help, it's permanent financial support that would destroy my client's retirement security. They're not asking for a loan or temporary assistance. They're demanding she fund a lifestyle they cannot afford for the foreseeable future. Eleanor's final point was the strongest. The plaintiffs made a major financial decision without securing my client's agreement. They had every opportunity to ask beforehand, to get her commitment in writing, to ensure she was on board. They chose not to because they knew what her answer would be. You cannot retroactively create an obligation through poor planning and wishful thinking. She sat down and the courtroom fell silent. Judge Reed listened without expression, taking occasional notes. When both attorneys finished, she sat back in her chair and looked directly at my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I have one question before I rule. The courtroom went silent. Did your daughter ever tell you she would pay this mortgage before you purchased the house? Diane opened her mouth, then closed it. Robert shifted in his seat. The silence stretched for several long seconds. We thought she would, Diane finally said. That's not what I asked. Did she explicitly agree to pay before you committed to the purchase? No, but, Judge Reed raised her hand. Thank you. I've heard enough. She spent the next 10 minutes explaining her ruling. No contract existed, written or verbal. Assumptions and expectations didn't create legal obligations. My parents had made a financial decision without securing my agreement, and they couldn't retroactively force me into their arrangement. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile. Judge Reed added that my parents were responsible for court costs and my attorney fees, which totaled close to $45,000. Ashley burst into tears. Robert put his arm around Diane, who stared straight ahead with a frozen expression. I felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. I pushed past them without comment. Eleanor fielded questions about the ruling while I got into my car and drove away. The media coverage was extensive. Legal experts analyzed the case on evening news shows, using it as a cautionary tale about family loans and informal agreements. Several articles praised Judge Reed's ruling as a clear statement on personal financial boundaries. The comment sections were split. Half the people applauded me for standing firm. The other half called me every name imaginable, saying blood should matter more than money. Ashley and Kevin lost the house 3 months later. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment across town. Diane and Robert downsized to a smaller condo, selling their house to recover some of the money they'd spent. None of them spoke to me again. Aunt Carol sent one final text calling me dead to the family. Cousins unfriended me on social media. The silence was absolute. I thought I'd feel relieved. Instead, I felt hollow. Laura took me out for dinner a week after the trial ended. She'd been through a similar estrangement with her family. And understood the complicated grief that came with it. "You did the right thing," she said, "even if it doesn't feel like it." I wanted to believe her. Some days I did. Other days I wondered if I'd traded my family for a principle. Work became my anchor. I threw myself into client projects, took on speaking engagements, published articles about financial planning. My career flourished while my personal life remained empty. A year later, I received a letter from Lily. She was 10 now, old enough to write her own thoughts. She said she missed me, asked if I was still mad at Mommy, wanted to know if I'd come to her birthday party. I stared at that letter for hours. The urge to reach out was overwhelming, but Ashley had made her position clear. Any contact with the kids would have to go through her, and she'd made certain that wasn't happening. I wrote back to Lily, keeping it light and loving. I told her I missed her, too. Explained that sometimes grown-ups disagree about important things, and said I hoped we could see each other someday. I sent a birthday gift through the mail. Ashley returned it unopened. The second year was harder than the first. Holidays felt empty. My apartment stayed quiet. I dated occasionally, but relationships never developed into anything serious. How could I explain this situation to someone new? I started volunteering at a financial literacy nonprofit, teaching young adults about budgeting and saving. Helping others plan their futures gave me purpose when my own felt directionless. My savings continued growing. I maxed out retirement contributions, invested wisely, built wealth that nobody benefited from but me. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 years after the trial, I ran into Kevin at a hardware store. He looked older, more tired. We made eye contact across the aisle. He nodded once, then turned away. No words exchanged, but something in that moment felt like closure. I still think about that phone call sometimes, wondering what would have happened if I just said yes. Maybe I'd have my family. Maybe Ashley and Kevin would have a house. Maybe Lily and Max would know their aunt. But I also know I'd have established a pattern that would have continued forever, the next crisis, the next need, the next assumption that my money existed to solve their problems. Saying no once had cost me everything. Saying yes would have cost me myself. Judge Reed's question echoes in my mind during difficult moments. Did your daughter ever tell you she would pay this mortgage before you purchased the house? The answer was no. It had always been no. They just never bothered to ask. I'm 38 now. My career is strong. My finances are secure and my life is peaceful. I have good friends, meaningful work, and freedom to make my own choices. But sometimes, late at night, I pull out that letter from Lily and wonder what price I really paid for standing my ground. The answer changes depending on the day. What I know for certain is this: family shouldn't mean financial hostage. Love shouldn't come with a price tag. And sometimes the cost of saying no is everything, but the cost of saying yes would have been even more. Judge Reed saw through the emotion to the facts. She asked the one question that mattered and waited for the honest answer. In doing so, she validated something I'd known but struggled to accept. I didn't owe them my life's work just because we shared DNA. I didn't have to set myself on fire to keep them warm. And their poor planning didn't constitute my emergency. The mortgage papers they tried to hand me stayed in their possession. The house eventually belonged to someone else, and I remained exactly who I'd always been. The daughter who saved, planned, and built her own security. They thought that made me selfish. I learned it made me free. How do you decide where to draw the line when family asks for financial help?